that things didn't necessarily, that the universe wasn't made of perfect spheres. That's one of the main ideas of the Ptolemaic version of the universe, that everything is perfect spheres. And Johannes Kepler kind of thought that way. He was like, I believe that geometry is the way that God communicates with us. So everything would be perfect. This was his thought. And by the time he was done, he had analyzed data from a man by the name of Tycho Brahe. I don't know if you guys know him, but if you want to find out a pretty weird fucking guy, look no further than this guy. He had no nose. He had a gold nose. Bit of an eccentric. But he had the best planetary observations of anybody out there. And by the time Kepler was done with the information, he had to admit that planets rotated in an ellipse. And that was hard for him. You know, this is a man who had every vested interest into believing that things were in perfect crystal spheres, and he had to abandon it. And I think that's the same thing for religious belief. That if you're really being honest about yourself, if you're really looking for those answers, you're going to stop believing. Because the answers that religion gives you are not satisfactory. They don't answer anything. In fact, sometimes they answer the exact opposite of what seems to be logical to you. If somebody says, oh, a virgin birth is possible, really? Is a virgin birth possible? Is parthenogenesis possible? Not really. We're not built like that. And people don't come back from the dead. I mean, maybe sometimes they were almost dead and they rise again, but if somebody's...
After 3 days.
After 3 days, yeah, exactly. I mean, it happens sometimes that a person will just, you know, be unconscious. Everybody assumes that they're dead and rises again. But I mean, this is not exactly a miracle here. It just turns out that death is not... You're not alive and suddenly dead. Okay, this is a common misconception. Death is a process. It takes a little while. Your body starts to die slowly. Every once in a while, you can kind of come back from it. That's the good news. But once you're dead, sorry guys, you're not going to come back. All right. Now, a lot of people ask me, where does belief come from? Right? What do we believe? It's a pretty good question because there really is no, I'm going to be honest with you, there really is no definite answer to that question. But I have a few theories. And I'm not the only one who thinks these theories, by the way. It's not my theories. I'm actually just a plagiarist. But one of the reasons that we are the way that we are, why we believe, why we have this belief engine, is partly because we're superstitious animals that see patterns where there sometimes is no pattern. And I'll give you an example from that. Pretend you're in the savannah, right? You're living about 30,000 years ago, and you're hunting, and you're a hunter and gatherer, and you see in the bush something that moves. Is it advantageous for you to ignore it, or to assume that something's there? If you assume that something is there, it's what's called a false positive. It may just be a bush, but there's a survival advantage into thinking that it's more dangerous than it actually is. So if you have a false negative, as in you're like, oh, that thing moving in the bush, no worries, you know what I mean? Like, that's how you're going to go. Everybody who was very skeptical probably died pretty early. So we have a natural predisposition to superstition. And one of the interesting ways that they proved this, or one man proved this, by the name of B.F. Skinner, is he tried to see if other creatures were superstitious. So his favorite animals, the pigeon, were his experimental subjects. Now, before I tell you what he did, I also want you to remember that this guy was a little bit of a nut. He actually developed a guided missile using pigeons. Pretty special guy. Yeah, the pigeon would be housed in a little container, have a window out, and it would peck which direction it wanted to go. It was actually probably one of the first guidance missiles that worked, but apparently nobody wants a guidance missile that has a pigeon in it. Anyway. Now, what he found was that if he put pigeons in a cage and randomly gave them food, the pigeons would start developing these weird behaviors. Like if the pigeon was sort of like rotating around when the pellet dropped, it would start doing this again and again, assuming that it was its behavior that had generated the food. And we're not really that different. I remember watching a special by Darren Brown. Have you guys heard of Darren Brown? If you have not, check out his stuff. That man is awesome. He set up an experiment with people where he put them in a room, and he just put a whole bunch of objects in that room, and on the top was some kind of clock. Well, it didn't count time, but it gave out points. And that was all there was to it. And basically he said, well, if you have this many points, then you will each make $50. What they didn't see was another sign that says, if you just leave now, you'll make $1,000. They didn't see that. So meanwhile, they were trying to, the people in the room were trying to figure out how to make points. So he put circles on the floor, and sometimes people would move on the circles or put yellow things on yellow things. And almost immediately, people assumed that there were patterns when there really were no patterns. So they put bananas on the yellow thing, they would jump up and down, and stuff like that, and they would watch as the points went up. And the ways that the points were calculated is actually there was a fish tank with a fish, and every time a fish would cross, he would just give him a point. So you couldn't get more random than this. But everybody was sure that they had figured out the trick. They're like, yeah, we know how it works. We were doing this, we were doing that, and all of a sudden, yeah, we got our points. And nobody realized until the experiment was over that it was all bullshit. They were like, no, there was no pattern. But we seek pattern. And it explains a lot about our beliefs. Because we are these pattern-seeking animals, we assume that there is some, I don't want to say divine will, but we assume that there is some person controlling what's happening. So if you're walking along with your family, and again, they just get fucking taken out, I don't know, a boulder falls on them, you will assume that somebody maybe pushed that boulder, or that there was some intent behind all this. We refuse, and this is the second reason why we refuse to believe that things just happen randomly. That a boulder could just fall one day and crush your whole family. You're like, this is impossible. Boulders don't just fall, and they don't kill people, and you're like, actually, they kind of do. It's like, you are the living proof of that. Well, you are. Your family isn't. Ooh, that's too easy. And the other reason I think that we are believing animals is because we have ingrained in us this need to follow traditions. And religion is probably one of the most ancient traditions that we do have. I think it makes sense that we believe in tradition. You can't reinvent the wheel every day. You have to follow what other people did. And in a time of scarcity, in a time where you don't know where your next meal is coming from, you do exactly what your dad fucking did. You don't start thinking outside the box. Well, sometimes you do, right? But we have this natural impulse to follow traditions. And religion is probably part of the biggest traditions that we do have. And there are weird ceremonies that we don't quite understand, but that we still do. Sometimes those ceremonies change over time. Sometimes they go from being incredibly violent, like human sacrifice or animal sacrifice, to being something a little bit more mild, where rather than kill a bunch of birds to wash away our sins, we drink a little bit of wine and say that it's blood, or eat a little wafer and assume that it's flesh. These are pretty disturbing kind of traditions. Why would anybody want to drink blood and eat flesh, right? It sounds kind of gross. Well, it's part of a more ancient tradition of how people used to absolve themselves of sins. So we follow these traditions. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we are religious. Anybody have anything to say? Yes, you.
You think those 3 points I tend to agree with, but do you think that religion is just a simple byproduct because we don't necessarily need that anymore?
Are you asking if we need if
yeah,
religion is...
do you think that religion would still play some survival, some piece to survival today for some people?
Well, I think that not so much now, because we have a lot more ways to share things with other people. Like, we have a lot more in common now than we used to.
Right.
And religion was a pretty good way of creating the sense of togetherness, where you're part of a community. But it's also really great at creating a sense of otherness. And this is actually one of those things that is starting to be a bit of a problem, and we're noticing this, right? Where all of a sudden it's like, oh, I'm a Christian, you're a Muslim, I gotta fucking kill you, or vice versa. I think actually anything that creates a sense of otherness is bad. Now, a person could say, doesn't atheism create a sense of otherness? Right? We do feel a little bit separate from Christians or other religious people, but I don't really feel separate as in, I think you're going to burn in hell, or I think that you need to be killed or converted. I feel for religious people. I have some of my best friends are religious. They believe in God, and sometimes I'm just like, I don't know how you can square that off, but I'm still friends with them. It's not much of an otherness, as it is more of our reactionary sort of, it's more reactionary on our part, where we're like, we don't believe in what we believe. But I mean, I think that as time goes on, religion is creating more of that division.